Okay, here we go. We're going to talk about affirmative action from Krystal Ball. Also, hello, Odin's Ravens. I hope. Wow, I almost said Odin's Wavens. Hello, Odin's Ravens. I hope you have a great time here.
All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, one of the more dramatic results to come out of the
One of the things I admittedly like about Krystal Ball, I always like what she's wearing. She's a very fashionable lady. Just throwing that out there.
election that we haven't really fully had a chance to dig into yet was the clear rejection by California voters of affirmative action. That's a measure in that state which would have ended the 1990s era ban on the practice in hiring and public university admissions, and it lost in a 15-point landslide. In fact, the only places with majority support for that measure were LA and in and around San Francisco. Rest of the state, not having it whatsoever. In places like Fresno, for example, a working class city that's roughly half white and half minority, the measure failed by a margin of 2-1. Keep in mind, too, affirmative action's failure in California came against the backdrop of many other progressive priorities finding widespread support. From a $15 minimum wage hike in Florida to a tax hike on the wealthy in Arizona
Let me just take one quick look at something, okay? I want to know a little bit more about what they're talking about, right? So I'm gonna look it up. Prop 16, California, 2020. Let's see. Okay. Let's take a look at this. Proposition 16 would permit government decision-making policies to consider race, sex, color, ethnicity. You guys can look at what I'm looking at, too. Oh my gosh. What? Okay, there we go. Would permit government decision-making policies to consider race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in order to address diversity by repealing Proposition 209. Proposition 209 was passed by voters in 1996 and says the state cannot discriminate or grant preferential treatment based on race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, education, or contracting. Proposition 16 is a legislatively referred constitutional amendment that requires a simple majority to pass. Let's take a look at basic pro and cons. All right. Pro. Measure expands equal opportunity to all Californians, increasing access to fair wage, good jobs, and quality schools for everyone. Fights wage discrimination and systemic racism, opening up possibilities for women and people of color. Yes, any analysis of this vote shouldn't discount the money spent on it. True. Let's see. Strip Constitution of its prohibition on discrimination and preferential treatment based on race. Argue that if there is anything that should be fundamental to our society, it's that the state should treat all Californians equally. Okay, let's take a look at the background. State and federal constitutions require equal protection. 1996, approved Proposition 209, adding a new section to the state constitution. Section 31 of Article 1, the new section generally banned the consideration of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment. Okay. Some exceptions to Proposition 209, state and local entities can consider sex when it's a necessary part of the normal operations. For example, the state can consider the sex of an employee when staffing specific jobs at state prisons where it is necessary for staff and inmates to be the same sex. Additionally, state and local entities may consider specified characteristics when it's required to receive federal funding. For example, the state is required to set goals for the proportion of contracts awarded to certain groups for federally funded transportation projects like businesses owned by women and people of color. Let's see. Before Proposition 209, had policies and programs intended to increase opportunities and representation for people who faced inequalities as a result of their... Okay. These programs are often called affirmative action programs. For example, some of the state's public universities considered race and ethnicity as factors when making admission decisions and offer programs to help support the academic achievements of the students. State and local entities had employment and recruitment policies intended to increase the hiring of people of color and women. State also established programs to increase the participation of women owning and minority-owned businesses in public contracts. The state set goals for the proportion of state contracts that were awarded to those types of businesses. After voters approved Proposition 209, these policies and programs were discontinued or modified unless they qualified for one of the exceptions. Let's see. Before Proposition 209 and local policies and programs that considered, state and local policies and programs still had to comply with federal law. Federal law establishes a right to equal protection and, as a result, limits the use of these considerations. For example, under federal law, universities may consider these characteristics as one of several factors when making admission decisions in an effort to make their campuses more diverse. To ensure compliance with federal law, these policies and programs must meet certain conditions that limit the consideration of those characteristics. These conditions were intended to prevent discrimination that violates equal protection. State law also has a number of anti-discrimination provisions that are similar to those in federal law. Interesting. After voters approved Proposition 209, some public entities in California created or modified policies and programs to instead consider characteristics not banned by Proposition 209. For example, many of the state's universities provide outreach and support programs for students who are first in their family to attend college. Many university campuses also consider where students attended high school and where they live when making admissions decisions. The universities view these policies and programs as a way to increase diversity without violating Proposition 209. Okay. So basically, guys, that's a very complicated way of saying right here that they were still considering race and ethnicity and all these things. Because guess what? Many people in our society, if they're poor, they're people of color. They get put in different parts of the city, which is why this entire program is like, yeah, we looked at where people lived. Let's see. Proposition 16. Proposal, if approved. Okay. So as a result, state and local entities could establish a wider range of programs and policies so long as they were consistent with federal and state law related to equal protection. Let's see. Any fiscal effects would depend on future choices. Okay. Yeah. All right. So this basically seems like they wanted to get rid of this so that they could go back to using affirmative action in a more direct way versus what this does, which is, versus what Proposition 209 does, which just makes it more difficult for them to do these things. Like they're still, guys, they're still doing affirmative action. They're just basing it on location instead of, they're just basing it off of location rather than anything else. Or first in your family to go to college. You know what groups typically are first in their families to go to college? Usually black people or Hispanic people. Child abuse is never justified. True, chat. I don't know what you guys are talking about anymore, but that is true. It is never justified. Let's see what the financing was, and I wonder why. All right. Is there anything in here? Official arguments. Okay. Yeah. Basically, this argument is that most of the contracts currently are going to predominantly places that employ white men rather than people who are otherwise qualified but get passed over. I'm curious, what's the evidence against beating? Yeah, Lord and Pole. I'm quite sure. Also, yeah, beating your kids. Lavender Gunner, engaging in acts of domestic violence doesn't make your kid better. That's yeah. You shouldn't abuse your children. How about that? All right, let's see what Krystal Ball has to say about this.
Choice voting in Alaska, progressive ballot initiatives overall had a pretty good night. Now, some activists have blamed the wording on the particular affirmative action ballot initiative, but as David Leonhardt points out over at the Times, affirmative action has actually failed in every single state where it has been tested at the ballot box over the past 30 years. So clearly, even in a state that votes overwhelmingly and routinely for Democratic candidates, a state which went strongly for Bernie Sanders in the primary, affirmative action is downright toxic. So what should we take from this? How should we think about it? Well, let's start with this. It's an obvious point, but often overlooked. A policy's popularity and its merit are two very distinct things. Not only do I have no problem with parties and politicians advocating for some unpopular positions, but I've actually got a lot of contempt for the ones who just follow the poll numbers and don't stick their neck out on anything as a matter of principle. It's easy to think of morally righteous positions, which were completely unpopular at the time, but proven correct ultimately by history. Bernie, of course, famously was on the unpopular side of a whole lot of issues throughout his career, from war to trade to gay rights, and he was correct and righteous in nearly every instance. However, I will say that while policies...
The sweet sound of a butt. The sweet sound of a butt from Krystal Ball.
...should certainly be judged on their merits rather than their popularity, there's something a little odd and very white savior patronizing about the fact that affirmative action appears to be most popular among white liberals and viewed with indifference or even contempt among the very racial minorities it's supposed to aid. So the 14 majority Latino counties in California, they all rejected that affirmative action.
Might it be viewed with contempt largely because of the way that white people tend to paint it as minorities getting in without merit on the basis of their race? Might it be because a lot of white people in the dominant culture in our society are vilifying people who get hired through affirmative action programs? I mean, I would say that probably that's why a lot of minority groups react extremely negatively to the concept of affirmative action. Not because the actual concept is bad, but because white people make it untenable.
Action ballot measure. Every single one of them. If the people that the policy is supposed to benefit don't actually see the benefit, then what exactly are we doing here? It's like if straight people had been the ones pushing gay marriage while gay people were like, actually we're good with civil unions. Or if it was mostly white people super hyped about a diversity pick for the vice presidential slot, just as one theoretical example here, you might reconsider your position if the folks you're aiming to help seem very uninterested in the flavor of help that you were actually offering. In fact, the more you dig into the policy, the more it kind of seems like it's about making affluent white people feel good about themselves and about the elite institutions and environments that they inhabit, much more so than it really is a project of justice. Look.
We know that small businesses are the backbone of our economy, yet Main Street businesses owned by women and people of color lose over $1.1 billion in government contracts every year because of the current law. Maybe it's not as simple as how Krystal Ball is framing it here. Maybe just an idea. Maybe $1.1 billion being funneled into black communities or communities of people of color and women. Maybe these would be a good way of slightly redistributing some of the wealth. Maybe just an idea.
Obviously, the largest and most powerful program of affirmative action is for the rich, whose parents can afford to dole out big donations to top-level schools and benefit from a privileged legacy status, not to mention who grow up with the tutors and resources and counselors to get them into those schools to begin with.
Today, nearly all public contracts and the jobs that go with them go to large companies run by older white men. I don't know. This feels like maybe it's going to. This is by opposing this. The effects have been to continue the trend that Krystal Ball is now claiming to be against. Anyway.
But that elite experience would be so much less enjoyable if you were truly faced with how completely exclusive the elite training pipeline really is, and how much more it has to do with your parents' bank account than it does with little Johnny's great promise.
She's literally making the argument that people who were for the affirmative action repeal, like, were trying to make. She's literally making the argument. Like, this is from the California State Voter Guide, guys. This isn't, like, super buried or anything. I'm on the fucking Wikipedia page. I like... Alright.
So diversity has been sold to affluent whites, not really as a project with the end goal of justice, although the trappings of that are nice and make them feel really good, but as a sort of lifestyle brand.
Again, $1.1 billion in government contracts every year that could be going to women and people of color. And she's pretending like this is a lifestyle branding thing. This is, when we're talking about $1 billion, guys, we're not talking about a lifestyle brand. We're talking about meaningful amounts of money going into communities that might really need it, or people who are historically disadvantaged.
And diversity has also been sold on a strictly transactional level too, as something that is actively beneficial to you and your kid. And that matters. Here's why. In the podcast Nice White Parents, they tracked the multi-decade history of one New York City public school, and it was actually kind of remarkable. White parents in the 60s were sold diversity exactly this way as a transaction good for them and their kids, and they lobbied aggressively for the local school board to locate this new public school in a zone right between the white neighborhood and the black neighborhood so that their kids might attend a diverse school. Once the school opened, however, none of the white families actually showed up. Why? Because when they were faced with the reality that the black students had been suffering through substandard, underfunded schools and were thus behind the white kids, and they realized that diversity could impose some cost on their own children, then they were out. Their relationship to diversity...
Wait, I need some citations on this. Are there citations? Because I need citations on this. Because so far, what I'm hearing is, I heard on a podcast one time that there was this one time that white parents said they wanted to send their kids to a diverse school, but then they really didn't want to actually go through with it. Oh yeah, Lord and Pole, yeah, $1 billion isn't even 1/100th of a Bezos. True. But also, let's not pretend like $1 billion in, like, to disadvantaged groups and communities isn't nothing. Again, all right, it was on a podcast sometime. Is she arguing that white people really didn't want integration? Is she trying to argue that, like, white people don't really want black kids in their schools still? I mean, I don't want to like misrepresent her, but I'm confused about her point.
It was purely transactional, and the second they felt they weren't getting a good deal, they were gone. Affirmative action is the type of program that poses little threat and only benefits to affluent white liberals. It's the college admissions version of identity politics, more about getting brown faces in high places to make white people feel good than it is about actually addressing the very real problems that it seeks to ameliorate. It's almost axiomatic that any policy supported.
Again, the entire point of affirmative action is not just to get like black and brown faces into boardrooms. It's to help help address the wealth gap. If they're getting into boardrooms with white people, they're making more money. Yes, fantastic pause. I agree. But they're making more money, which helps address the wealth gap, or at the very least not make it worse. So I'm confused about this. Like, she's just saying it's not doing a good job of addressing the wealth gap, and I agree, but that's because it needs to be paired with other policies that redirect wealth towards these communities.
Overwhelmingly by brunch liberals is unlikely to really forge any structural change or justice. But let's look at the data anyway. So, affirmative action does in fact marginally improve Black and Latino admissions into elite universities.
Yep.
According to Matt Iglesias, after affirmative action was banned in California in the 90s, the number of Black students at UC Berkeley fell from 6 or 7% to just 3%, and Latinos make up only about 15% of Berkeley's freshmen.
Just to clarify here, again, after they passed this in 1996, the African American students at UC Berkeley were cut in half. In half.
Freshman class, even though they are actually a majority of public school graduates in that state. So, by that metric, affirmative action is successful. But just getting more minorities into high-level colleges, that's not actually supposed to be the goal. The goal is supposed to be reducing the racial wealth and income gap, and on that metric, affirmative action has been a complete failure.
Wait, I need to back this up because I can't believe what I'm hearing.
But just getting more minorities into high-level colleges, that's not actually supposed to be the goal. The goal is supposed to be reducing the racial wealth and income gap, and on that metric, affirmative action.
Let's see. There we go. Let's take a look at the economic impact of college degrees. Okay. Let's see. If you have a bachelor's degree, you contribute $278,000 more to your local economy over your lifetime. You contribute more in taxes. You contribute more in charitable giving. Does Krystal Ball think that not getting more Black people into college and making sure that they're earning more money over their lifetime is not a good goal? And this isn't even like total, guys. This is just on top of what a high school diploma would get them. All right. Apparently getting more minorities in college so that they can earn more money over their lifetime, not a good goal. Yeah.
Has been a complete failure. In fact, after generations of racial preferences in college admissions processes, the racial wealth gap is larger now than it was back in 1968. So the policy is not particularly effective, it's politically toxic, and is rejected by voters everywhere and every time that it's tried. And
it's not we should maybe consider, why is it when it clearly does have an effect, and that effect was to double the black admission at UC Berkeley, when it clearly has an effect, why are we not seeing it in a larger trend? Why didn't we see a larger trend? And I think that that's largely something that's addressed by the wider economic trends in the United States. Like, this is something where, like, over time, people who are working service jobs, who are working fast food jobs, they're making less money now than previously. Like, the minimum wage hasn't increased meaningfully since, like, the 70s. So, like, again, the wider problem is that we have a lot of black and brown people in this country working minimum wage jobs, working extremely low wage, high stress jobs. And, like, this is part of the fundamental problem of America. This is why in Chicago, again, the average white family has, or the average black family has 1/40th the amount of wealth of the average white family. And I think, like, in certain places in the United States, like, it's like the average white family has, like, on average, like, $250,000 in wealth, and the average black family has, like, $9 in wealth. So, like, yeah, we can address all of these things with bigger, wider policies, but I don't think that affirmative action is bad. It doesn't have the biggest effect that it needs in order to affect a wider change because of all of the other economic forces. It might be a decent tool in the kit, but, like, you can't build a car with, like, a screwdriver. You need other tools. I mean, and again, I see people in chat saying it's bad. Well, but then consider that white men in this country had affirmative action for, like, 450 years. Like, yeah, affirmative action is bad, but, like, don't we need something to kind of counter that the badness of that? I would say that maybe we do. Maybe we do. Maybe we do need affirmative action to counter 450 years head start. So yeah, like, this is just, I think that this argument against affirmative action is very silly.
It fuels racial resentment.
Oh, and Holsky, it's not about being fair, it's about being equitable. And there's a big difference between those two things. If you have, for example, people trying to get into college and they have their family has 1/40th the amount of wealth of a competing family, it's going to be much harder for them to get into college. And if we have racial perceptions of them as being unintelligent because of that economic gap, then yeah, they might need a counterbalance to that built-in racial bias. Yeah, I don't think this is a particularly hard thing to wrap your head around, you know? And yeah, we do need to eliminate poverty of all races, but part of that is understanding that, like, we're not all on an equal playing field right now. There are some people who are significantly less well off than the average person in America, and we need to be able to address those inequalities if we're going to have a hope of building a coalition that can move forward to address the inequities faced by all of us. Any argument for AA that doesn't include reparations as an end goal is ridiculous to IMO. True. Martin Luther King didn't like affirmative action. Martin Luther King was for equitable treatment of all people. And the first step towards equitable treatment of all people is by recognizing that not all people are on an even playing field. Yeah, exactly. Butch Bay is exactly correct. Affirmative action is a Band-Aid. It's a Band-Aid, and it's a small step, but I think it's a necessary step, especially when apparently in America we're not willing to properly dress the wound. We're content to just bleed out. And hey, I'd like it if we didn't bleed out. how much reparations per person, I think that's a bad argument to make. I think we should instead be investing in Black and brown communities, because typically we don't. And realistically, the amount per person that you would have to pay Black and brown people, especially Black people in this country who come from enslaved families, how much money do you think 400 years of enslaved servitude is worth? It's worth a fucking lot. It's worth a fucking lot. We don't have enough money to pay that back. It's literally an incalculable number. So when I say we need to invest in these communities, I mean we need to actually invest in them. Invest in black-owned businesses. Have the government step in to provide these loans. Have the government step in to build community centers and invest in schools in these developed areas. Because guess what? Black people also got left behind when it came to schooling. Because rich people in inner cities, they just had their kids go to private school and let the public school rot. So we need to invest in all of these communities and all of these things to benefit the wider Black community. And I don't think it's a good solution necessarily to pay each person a set amount. But and I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers when it comes to reparations, but it's undeniable that we need to do something to right this historic injustice. We can't be sitting here and be like, yeah, everything's hunky-dory now, when the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow stares at us every day in every major city in America. I think that is it's a recipe for alienating the Black community, and it's just not right. When you boil it down, it's just not right. And if we ever want to build a cohesive coalition, we need to recognize it's just not right, and we need to make it right. Or at the very least, again, we need to try to make it right. Because again, that's my whole platform. We might not be able to succeed in making a socialist state in our lifetimes, but we need to try. We might not be able to address climate change adequately in our lifetimes, but we have to try. And it's the same with reparations. This attitude of it's too much, it's just not feasible, blah 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 blah. I don't like it. That's some doomer shit right there. And on this channel, we don't go for doomer shit. We only go for hope pill. And with the hope pill, we can do it, okay?
Resentment among the multiracial working class. But you shouldn't just throw up your hands and declare that these massive inequalities between races and between classes have to stand. In fact, any universal programs which disproportionately benefit the poor and the working class are in fact racial.
Well, again, Lavender Gunner, if you extrapolate people being unjustly interred in internment camps for several years, and they each got $20,000, well, just multiply that by however many years Black people were put into indentured servitude, slavery, forced into servitude. So multiply 20,000 by whatever metric for however long you want to determine slavery was around, and you'll get roughly your ballpark estimate, okay? Let me know what it is, because I'd be curious, but yeah, it's going to be a fucking big number.
Equity programs. As Iglesias points out, in Florida, where a $15 minimum wage just passed, a majority of Black and Latino Floridians will benefit as they currently earn less than that rate. He also points out that researchers say 20% of the 1960s decline in the Black-white wage gap came from the 1966 lifting of the minimum wage. Eliminating college debt would actually disproportionately benefit minorities. Black students are more likely to be burdened with college debt and take on larger loads on average than their...
This is just kind of a weird argument, because she already admitted that affirmative action does marginally work. So all of these things work too, so why not have affirmative action on top of that, I guess?
White counterparts. Look, I can certainly imagine racially targeted policies which may be unpopular, but are just and are worth fighting for, and worth dealing with the white racial resentment and backlash over. On the merits, however, affirmative action just doesn't make the cut. And those numbers that Iglesias pulled about the way how much minimum wage increases due to alleviate racial inequity, so much more than affirmative action has done.
Yeah, but that's what I was talking about earlier. Gosh. Good Lord. One second. Do. Yeah, so just FYI, Lavender Gunner, that would be around $321 trillion. Even the United States doesn't have that cash laying around. But anyway, yeah, the Krystal Ball is
done over 50 years
Yes.
of being instituted in public.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. I forgot. Again, graduating from college increases the net amount you earn over the course of your lifetime. And she's just discounting that. On top of that, like, again, this was about putting money into black and brown businesses. Again, like, this was also, like, a point I made earlier about, like, the reason a lot of these companies, a lot of black and brown communities have been held back over the years is largely due to, like, the stagnation of our wages in the United States. So, like, this is, I mean, maybe Chris Matthew, but, like, I don't know, the way she's
Public
shellacking it makes me feel there's something else going on here, and I'm not quite getting it. Plus, like, again, yeah, we know that increasing these wages disproportionately helps black and brown people because disproportionately they have these jobs. This isn't new, but that's also why, like, affirmative action is necessary so that you can get more black and brown people into colleges and normalize that admissions process and tackle the racism that's at the top of our society. It's not just at the bottom.
universities, it says it all.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Matt has done some of the best work on this, and I was just actually looking yesterday at this chart that I pulled up. The bottom 75% of whites in America have identical wealth as the full black population. So the entire racial wealth gap, as we understand it, is between the top 10% of whites and the top 10% of blacks. Both of those groups hold the majority of wealth in that category. Same with college degrees. Same with non-college degrees. Same with every racial group in America. Are you beginning
I hate this guy. I hate Sagar so much.
to sense a pattern? If you break it down by every metric possible, the top 10% owns the majority of the wealth, which means any redistributive policy or universalist policy which affects things across the board is going to rise from the bottom 50% up within that category. That is how you solve these problems. I've been beating this drum for a long time against the identitarians because it's just like, this is what Iglesias says. He says that almost every racial inequality can be greatly ameliorated with normal redistributive policy. And Democrats have tied themselves into the knots with the idea that this is not true. And it's so obviously true.
It's completely obvious.
And guys, he's not entirely wrong here. Like, he's not. Which is one of the things that galls me to say, but he's not. He might be a fascist, he might be a nationalist, but, like, you need to be able to run on these things, and you need to be able to point out that, yeah, despite the fact that the top 10% of these groups, ignoring the disparity on ignoring the disparity on the bottom among the 90% below that is absolutely abhorrent. And we need to be able to speak to the people who are in that 90%. We need to be able to speak to these people and get them over to our side. And you can only get them over to your side if you recognize that they have a struggle that is not the same as the struggle of white people in the bottom 90%. So, like, again, and Revolt Rise is pointing this out in chat, it's very frustrating because, like, there is that grain of truth in there, that grain of truth, but you can't take everything that comes out of his mouth as true. And so, like, he's correct in that we need to be able to appeal to all of these people, but he's incorrect in that you need to actually acknowledge the differences between these groups, or else you get a fracturing in your base, and that fracturing is enough to completely undermine you. You cannot achieve this without first and foremost removing lobbying and money from politics. That's the first step. Well, I think we can do a bunch of things at once, and I'm for removing lobbying and money from politics, but I think that we also need to advocate for a lot of other things too. Oh yeah, his perspective is definitely true when it comes to Republicans.
Alternative, I want to be
because a lot of Republicans are fascists.
Fair, are a bunch of Republicans who don't believe in any redistribution or in increasing wages whatsoever.
No,
so
they
I
just
get
say
it.
Everything's great, the meritocracy, the American dream,
So,
bootstraps, it's already fine.
So
I get it. I am not.
He would cream his jeans over, like, the idea of a Republican running on a populist platform. He'd be giddy. Absolutely giddy.
I'm not saying there are a lot of people on the right who hold my position because they're much more concerned with the debt than they are with any of this. But if you want to solve it, this is the only way. That's it.
Well, and that's my thing is, like, look, I believe in certain policies which are not popular. That's fine. And it's one of the things that I do actually...
Which policies? Which policies, Krystal? Please tell us.
Admire in politicians. Like, it's one of the things I really admired about Andrew Yang, right? He comes out...
Yeah, this is why the most... Yeah, CMA Gruder. Yeah, I saw that too. Yeah, this is why the Republican Party blew an absolutely colossal hole in the budget, even prior to COVID. This is why they just blew... Yeah, they really care about the debt. If you do many things at once, people get confused and the effort is not focused enough. The effort disperses and we get marginalized. Well, my point is to build up a socialist coalition. And a socialist coalition is inherently anti-lobbying, inherently anti-money in politics. And I think that making that clear is something that is very important. But I'm also very interested in advocating for the ideas of decommodification and worker co-ops. And yeah, there are people who tackle the problem of money in politics much more effectively than I do.
Nobody even knew what UBI was.
Had a 20% approval rate.
20% approval. Like, everyone's like, we don't know what this is, and if we did, we don't like it, right? Mm-hmm. But he was like, no, I did the research. I believe this is the right policy. And he got into the race to advance that ball, and it worked. And now we are in a different place in that conversation, and it's been incredibly powerful and effective what he was able to do. So I have respect for that. But it has to be a policy that's actually worth it. And with things like affirmative action, which I do tie into kind of the same category of, like, putting Kamala Harris on the ticket. Totally. It's much more about, like, signaling to the world how enlightened you are than it is about the actual result. And this is, like, outside of...
Here, this reminds me of when PragerU got really upset at Kamala Harris and called her a communist for showing this video.
So there's a big difference between equality and equity. Equality suggests, oh, everyone should get the same amount. The problem with that, not everybody's starting out from the same place. So if we're all getting the same amount, but you started out back there and I started out over here, we can get the same amount, but you're still gonna be that far back behind me. It's about giving people the resources and the support they need so that everyone can be on equal footing and then compete on equal footing. Equitable treatment means we all end up at the same place.
So, like, yeah, there are some problems maybe with this general outlook, but I feel the same way about how PragerU, like, like, piled on her as, like, her being a communist as I do about, like, these two people ranting about affirmative action. Like, yeah, I mean, it's not the best solution, but, like, it's also better than nothing, and especially better than what was happening in, like, the 1970s and 80s when it came to these policies.
Race relations or any of that, this is one of my major critiques of mainstream liberals, is they care more about their own projection of virtue than they do any ultimate goal or acquisition of power.
True! That's what we just saw in the Kamala Harris video. Oh, Krystal's not a comrade. No.
They don't really care about change.
Krystal's main problem is she sometimes has really bad takes, but mostly that she enables this man over here, who is, he's a fascist. He's a nationalist who believes in populist policies. And she kind of, like, for lack of a better word, whitewashes him, makes him more palatable to people.
Changing things. They mostly care about projecting that they're good people, that they're not racist. Look, that's good. I'm glad if if you're really not racist, that's fantastic. Congratulations, good for you. But if you are actually just looking at the numbers, which policies will move the needle most on the issues you claim to care about, you're headed in the wrong direction.
Couldn't agree more.
So this is part of what I hate about Krystal Ball, is that at least in this video, okay, I really dislike that she's basically shitting on this policy, right? And it's something that she even acknowledged in the video that did marginally help people of color. But, like, it seems like her main complaint is that it doesn't help people of color enough. And I agree. But if it does help, then why are you against it so much? Like, this, like, there's a lot of, like, venom here for something that she admits helps. So, like, I guess I'm in this spot where I'm just like, this is a weird thing to plant your flag on when you're saying it does help. The main problem is it just doesn't help enough. And I agree, but why are you making an issue out of this thing? It helps individual people of color, but not the communities as a whole. I mean, that might be true. But, like, yeah, I'm not against helping individual people of color either. The venom keeps the news shows sexy. Wait, the news sexy? It's not warranted? Well, I don't know. I don't like these people. I need to get better at articulating why I don't like them. Sagar's face. Yeah, it does. Good catch, Lorden. This is exactly like the setting of, like, yeah, that is really bad. That's right, Krystal. It is bad. That's right. The Democrats wanting affirmative action really is bad, isn't it?